Would that chair the Speaker of the House sign in? No, look at I. Don't worry about it. I'm kidding. The matching chair is upstairs, the Vice President sat in, and the third matching chair is over where the Supreme Court met, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So Congress will meet here for 10 years. Think about them approving the Constitution in the Pennsylvania State House next door, and then they have to come here and figure out how to implement this new document, which is a totally new form of government. But because you're only in, so Congress will meet here for 10 years. Think about them approving the Constitution in the Pennsylvania State House next door, and then they have to come here and figure out how to implement this new document, which is a totally new form of government. But because you're only in States, we're standing here, or maybe up there, and they will swear in John Adams as the second President of the United States. Afterwards, there's a little bit of polite applause. George Washington will stand up. You don't have to stand up. But George Washington will stand up, and out of courtesy to the first President of the United States, the room will get quiet. Everybody expects George Washington to leave the room first, and he pauses and says, "No, Mr. Adams, you should leave first, because now you're the President of the United States, and I'm just a private citizen." He's trying to set the precedent. Back then, that's a radical idea, because no government has ever done it. At that time, people were kings, and when you died, someone in your family becomes king. Ever in the world will happen right here. There'll be other arguments and debates in this room. Hamilton will come in the room and try to create the first bank of the United States. Each of the states at that time had their own money. You can't leave outside, guys, until you're busy. He says, nowhere in the Constitution does it say we should have, does it say we need to start the first bank of the United States in the 4 pages of the Constitution. But he also says either it's Google or email. No. But he says, nowhere in the Constitution does it say, so they'll set that precedent in this room. Jefferson didn't want the bank because he didn't trust the government to run a national bank. He was a states' right guy. He didn't want a central government. And that's why he doesn't get along with Adams. Later in life, they don't even talk to each other.
Several days that month, and on the 1st of July. And even on the morning of July the 1st, you would have heard some dissenting voices here. Not every member of Congress is prepared to take this final step. And outside of this room, there are thousands who will choose to remain loyal to the king. It is a decision that will divide people, will divide families. And for many in the room, it is much more than a political decision. It's deeply personal. To secure these rights, governments are instituted, governments deriving their just power not from a king or a queen, but from whom? And this is the really revolutionary part. The authority is supposed to come from the consent of the government, from the people. We will get one final copy that is engrossed on parchment for the delegates to sign. So today you can see the original one in the National Archives, Washington. This one is a $5 copy from the gift shop. But this is the room where it is presented. And John Hancock, the president, here at the front of the room will be the first to sign, and many others as well. Benjamin Franklin with Pennsylvania's delegation here in the middle of the room. Thomas Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee. In all, 56 will sign their names to this declaration and take a tremendous risk in doing so. We mentioned the word treason already. In the eyes of many, these men are committing it. They are also committing themselves and thousands of Americans to a long war to win the Constitution and this whole idea that people could govern themselves without kings or queens, without inherited positions of power, a set of ideas that we're still experimenting with today, 21st century, set of ideas that have spread to many other parts of the world. So that's where we're going to end our visit.
Okay, please go.
I'm from the U.S. and today I visited the Liberty Bell and the Independence Hall in the Congressional Chambers, and it's just cool to see the foundation of my country.
Okay, so what's your name?
Oh, Samuel.
So the full name?
What?
Full name.
Samuel Stoner Eby.
Okay, so U.S. where?
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania. You're a student?
Yeah.
Okay. So just one more time. Why did you come here today?
I came to visit.
Okay. So what did you see there? Or what did you feel?
I saw the Liberty Bell, Independence Hall. It's powerful to me to see the foundation of my country.
You too?
Yeah, look at him. Don't look at the camera.
Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Jan, and I'm from Rwanda. I'm 18 and I'm a student. Today I got to visit the Liberty Bell, the Congressional Hall, and just a place where the whole United States as we know it today was started.
So what do you feel?
I feel really good to know that the great nation that the US has become actually starts within this building. It's actually humbling to see such things.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm Andrew, I'm from Philadelphia, and I'm here because my friend is visiting from Iowa, so showing him around the city.
So what did you see today?
Independence Hall, the Liberty Bell, that's it so far.
So what did you feel about what you see today?
I felt great, you know, you see where this country was born, it's freedom, so it's a great feeling.
So you proud of the what?
Yeah, very proud. I'm happy to live here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay.
Okay, sure. Hi, how you doing?
What's your name?
Oh, my name's. Okay. My name's Derek. Derek, and I'm here to see the Congress Hall. Yes, we get to see Congress Hall. For my daughter was getting some education for a project she was doing.
So what did you feel about that and with your family?
Oh no, it was great because we learned a lot about our country and more about how the Declaration of Independence and how the country was formed. It was great.
Okay. What was the most interesting or impressive thing you saw there?
Oh man, I would say where the president, when the president decided he was going to, or when the president changed hands in the Congress Hall, that was nice. It was and how each person was represented in that hall. And I saw that was pretty interesting.
Okay, just last question. What do you think about the freedom and democracy?
Oh man.
The relationship with the Constitution.
Oh my gosh. It's important. It's one of the most important documents that's ever done. I mean, for it I mean, you can't, in some countries you can't even get it. It's great. It's one of the most important things we have in this country.
Thank you.
Okay, you're right.
Professor Berman, nice to see you today.
Glad to be here.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Sherry Berman. I'm a professor of political science here at Barnard College at Columbia University in New York.
Would you briefly explain about the Revolutionary War?
The Revolutionary War, well, that was our war of independence, and it was largely a war about representation. The American colonists felt that they were not being fairly or equitably represented in the political system in Britain, which was the colonizing power, and so they wanted to have representation and decided that the only way that they could do that was to have their own country where they could have their own government. So this was a desire for us to have a say in the political decisions that would influence the lives of Americans as they came to be known.
Okay. In terms of republicanism, what is the core value of the first American Constitution?
Do you mean the Articles of Confederation?
Yeah. I mean republicanism. Republicanism.
Republicanism.
Yeah.
So republicanism is about people ruling themselves, and in particular ruling themselves without a king, which was one of our problems with Britain. That is to say that we were not fully represented, and we felt that the system did not allow representation that justified things like taxation and other decisions being made. So republicanism is basically the idea that people should rule themselves as much as possible and be able to make decisions about taxation and other things that are going to influence their lives.
In the Constitutional Assembly, those who insist that each provincial self the government, and some people want a strong federal government. They, doesn't not disagree on everything, but they, kind of have some conflict. So could you explain about that conflict?
So the first governing form for what came to be known the United States was the Articles of Confederation, which basically was a union among the various states that made up the original 13 colonies. And the problem with that, sort of as we're seeing in Europe today, was that each one of those states protected their own interests. The central government had very little power. It couldn't tax. It couldn't defend it didn't have the ability to have an independent defense force. And so within several years, it became clear that without some kind of more centralized authority, what came to be known as the United States could simply not function. And so we had a constitutional convention. Is this the question that you were asking? Okay, so we had a constitutional convention that was designed to try to fix some of the problems with the looser form of government we originally had, which was a union among the various states. What came to be the American Constitution therefore gave us a system that was relatively unique at the time. We had both a centralized government at the national level and significant powers left to the states at the state, provincial, or regional level, what we now think of as a federal system. But that was very unusual at the time, and it was designed as a compromise between those who preferred power at the lower levels, state, regional, and those who thought that the only way the United States could prosper was with a stronger central government. So the Constitution we have is really a compromise between those who wanted more decentralized and those who wanted more centralized power.
Okay. So U.S. Constitution has been revised many times. How many times and why?
So there were 27, or there have been 27 amendments to the Constitution, and they cover a wide variety of different issues. The first 10, probably the most important, are what came to be known as our Bill of Rights. And those really lay out very carefully the kinds of rights that citizens of the United States have, particularly the kinds of things that governments are not supposed to interfere with. So for instance, the First Amendment, maybe the one that's most discussed and most often imitated, protects things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. These are things that governments are not supposed to interfere with unless there's some compelling other interests. Other amendments include things like the right to bear arms, very controversial in the United States. The amendments after the first 10 amendments also provided rights, citizenship, and access to other kinds of civil and political rights for slaves after the Civil War. Other later amendments gave women the right to vote. So we've had 27 in all. So this is not something that's happened very often, particularly since the first 10 were taken right after the Constitution was put in place. And again, designed to assure new members of the United States that the government would not be despotic in the way they envisioned the British government having been before the Revolution.
Okay, so you actually answered the question I'm going to ask next. But okay, let me ask the same question. So beside the First Amendment you explained, among the 27 amendments, what is the most important, amendments you think that through that the people can understand the history of the U.S. democracy?
So all of the amendments are important, but probably the ones that have been most significant and perhaps the most contentious are probably the first, again, which covers freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. Those are the kinds of rights that are assumed to be necessary for a truly liberal democracy. Without those rights, democracy is very much thin or meaningless. These are things that citizens should not have infringed upon by the government. And these have been the subject of endless debates, interpretations, court cases. We still discuss them very much today. And so that one is probably sort of foundational, again, sort of defining the limits of what a liberal democracy is. In the United States, also very controversial has been the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, which again is viewed by many other countries as a kind of strange thing, but makes perfect sense against the backdrop of how the United States was formed in a revolutionary anti-colonial struggle against the British, very much seen as an important right for citizens to have to prevent government tyranny, to protect the United States, those kinds of things. But again, has been a bone of much contention and interpretation throughout our history. Crucial also are the amendments that were taken after the Civil War, which began to provide full citizenship rights for former slaves. It granted them citizenship, it granted them access to many other constitutional rights, and so those were really rights that began to spread throughout the entire United States population, things that had previously been limited only to a smaller subset, that is to say, adult white males.
Let's talk about a little bit about the voting rights. Why someone always has been trying to block the right of vote, into certain, classes, genders, and ethnics. So why the voting right is important?
So the United States has an extraordinarily long history as a democracy, but throughout that history, not everyone actually has been allowed to vote. So initially, at the birth of the United States, voting was limited to white men who had property. Those restrictions were gradually eliminated. Of course, slaves could not vote. They were technically given the right to vote after the Civil War, but those rights were very much restricted, in the South in particular, by a whole variety of sort of tests and other restrictions that were placed on the right to vote to assure that even though legally former slaves were entitled to vote, practically they were unable to. And these kinds of restrictions lasted up through the second half of the 20th century. Now, courts very much during the last decades of the 20th century have tried to eliminate restrictions on the right to vote. But it's very tempting for politicians to try to sneak some of them back in to limit access to voting indirectly for groups that they believe will not support them. So even though it is illegal to stop people from voting, putting in place restrictions on, for instance, the kinds of identification that you need to vote, when votes happen, so during the week in the United States, which is unusual, which means, of course, that people who work or have very busy lives have more difficulty coming to voting places, limiting how you can vote outside of a voting place, so not allowing people, for instance, easy access to absentee or other ballots. All of these are kind of indirect ways that politicians have kind of tried to limit the access to the vote. But yes, it is illegal to do so, but these things are kind of snuck in as seemingly objective ways just of ensuring that the vote is actually, not abused. But there's very, very little evidence of voting fraud in the United States, despite constant attempts to kind of put in place certain kinds of restrictions that are ostensibly designed to prevent that.
Are you familiar with the turmoil political situation for the last couple of years in South Korea?
Well, I know your president was impeached. Yeah, and that you had an election earlier in this year which replaced the president.
Huge and long-standing demonstration.
Yep.
It was very peaceful.
Yep.
But for that, so it's a kind of new government. Just
Yep.
1 year old. So as a political scientist, professor, do you have any advice to the new government?
So from the perspective of a scholar of democracy, I would say that what's happened in Korea actually over the last year is very impressive. It's unfortunate, of course, that a president was impeached and seen to have been involved in a whole variety of corruption scandals. But the fact that that process happened legally, it happened according to the processes that have been laid out in law, that it was accompanied by mass mobilization, but peaceful and legal. These are extremely impressive kinds of characteristics for a democracy to exhibit. Transitions of power are always difficult, especially when they happen outside the norm. And so having seen that process unfold in South Korea is a really impressive sign of the maturity of democracy in your country. As far as advice for the incoming government, I don't have anything in particular to say other than that obviously continuing this transition and making sure that the rules of the game are adhered to, and hopefully that procedures are put in place to avoid corruption in the future would only strengthen Korean democracy even further.
Okay. So the Constitution itself can guarantee the democracy and social justice, as you see many countries. They have constitution, but there is corruption, the dictatorship, the harassment and oppression. Still, why constitution is important to we achieve the social justice and democracy?
So constitutions set out the rules of the game for a political system, for democracy in particular. It tells politicians and citizens what is and is not allowed, and generally what the sort of goals or the defining principles of any particular government are. So constitutions are the kind of foundation of democracy, but they're the beginning of the process, not the end, right? You also have to ensure that politicians and citizens understand the spirit of the laws and the rules of the game, and sort of embed within their political behavior the norms of democratic politics, compromise, toleration, the legitimacy of opposition. So all of these things come after constitutions are put in place. So you need a constitution because you can't play a game without clearly defined rules. But the rules themselves are just part of what makes a democracy function well. You also need to have politicians and citizens who really adhere to the norms that make democracy work. And that's a process that can take a significant amount of time. It took a long time in the United States for this kind of fuller conception of liberal democracy to really spread, and it generally takes a long time in new democracies as well. So you start with a constitution and then you build upon it all kinds of other aspects that make democracy function well, peacefully, legally, and to the benefit of all citizens.
Okay, thank you. Last question. What does Constitution mean to American people?
So I think in the United States, unlike in a lot of other countries, since we were not originally founded on one particular ethnic or religious group, the Constitution is really what defines the United States. So some people, for instance, think it's almost a quasi-religious document. We have it in a special case. It's treated like some kind of venerated object, and we are constantly referring to it to justify a whole variety of different kinds of political activities and decisions. So the Constitution is one of the sort of defining things, not just of the American government, but of the American people. It sets out principles that we think define us as a country, and it sets out principles that we think really define us and distinguish us as a people. So it's really very much part of American identity and not just the foundation of our political system.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was excellent.